I left the city, I've been browsing, treading water that they drowning. My head on a swivel, yeah. It's only really my surroundings.
Hello and welcome to episode 67 of the Smash Accept podcast. We are double dipping today. Earlier in the day, John and I were on and we were talking about week 14 and some strategy. Now, episode 67, Mung and I are going to talk about week 15, talk about all the matchups that are coming down, the breakdowns. I mean, this is playoff time. This is what we've been gearing you guys up for the entire year. Hopefully you guys have, listened to some things and learned some things along the way, and you guys are in that playoff spot. And along the way, we'll give you a couple ideas of who you should be trading for, who you should be, if you're on a rebuild team. But for the most part, we're talking playoffs right now. Playoffs, Mung. That's what we're going to talk about, playoffs.
Where's John when you need him? Officially known as Playoff John, but yeah, hope you guys made the playoffs in at least one of your leagues, or if you only play in one, that you've made it this far. And it's funny because I'm usually not much of a risk taker when we talk about dynasty trades, building dynasty rosters, but the fantasy playoffs, they're all about variance, right? It's just
right.
1 week, same as the NFL playoffs, right? That's why, anything can really happen. And there's so much variance that I actually try not to worry too much about, playing your studs. I know that's a prevalent strategy in fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say start your studs, and I'm not afraid to go against that a little bit. Obviously, you're not benching high risk guys for other high risk guys unless you're big underdogs. But overall, I think this is when you have to manage expectations and really go for those ceiling outcomes, almost like a DFS style. If you do think that you're a big underdog this week.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about it takes skill to get into the playoffs. And I feel like when people talk about and they get new into dynasty or into fantasy, they're like, oh, it's all about luck. It does take skill for roster management, playing the waivers, making your trades to get into the playoffs. But when you get into the playoffs, it's not always the best team that wins it, right? It's the team that gets hot. It's the player that goes off that certain week. It's that gutsy call you make. And John and I alluded earlier quite a bit about, safe floors, high ceilings. Are you the favorite? Or are you the underdog? Like if you're the favorite, sometimes you don't want to play that real high risk, high reward. And other times if you're the underdog, because there's a lot of teams. I mean, there's one league right now where I am projected to beat someone by 65 points. He should be playing guys that are literally all ceiling, right? Like he can't afford to be getting into those kind of situations. And we're going to talk about some of these guys when we get in here, what their ceilings look like, what their floors and all those kind of things. And Mung, but I don't want to toot our horns several times throughout this episode. I did it on the one with John, but 6 weeks ago, you and I did the buy low candidates to get you into the playoffs. Those guys were James Conner, it was Leonard Fournette, it was Hunter Renfrow. Those were three of the biggest guys that we were saying go out there and get them. And if you picked up those three guys in any kind of trade format, you're probably in the playoffs at this point. I mean, those three guys have really been carrying a lot of teams.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, just kind of going back to it, right? When we talk about these in-season trades, we're projecting for multiple games. But once we get into the fantasy playoffs, we're really just trying to project for this specific coming week. And then we'll worry about next week when we get to next week, if we get to next week.
Well, let's jump right into it, because I feel like a lot of people are going to know what their playoff situation looks like after Thursday. I mean, we have the Chiefs at the Chargers. And that is a game where it's going to be make or break, right? I mean, we have the Chiefs. It's a difficult situation. Mahomes has been up and down. You got to start Tyreek Hill. You got to start Kelsey. They haven't been putting up the numbers. Clyde Edwards-Helaire this past week comes out with the 2 touchdowns, but not a lot of volume. Start first on the Chiefs side of the ball here. I mean, let's talk a little bit about some of these struggles. John was saying, he might not be starting Patrick Mahomes, or he might be trying to find that next guy. In the playoffs, you got to have that team where those are the guys that are going to win you the week, but there's a lot of variance right now.
Yeah, it's not crazy. I mean, teams are playing a ton of too high safeties against Patrick Mahomes. They know that they have to limit those huge plays that they were getting by on in the past couple of seasons. And I do think it's crazy to bench Tyreek Hill, but I also don't think it's crazy to expect another fairly quiet game. I mean, when these two teams faced off earlier in the year, he really didn't do a whole lot. I think just 5 or 6 catches, no touchdowns. And Tyreek Hill hasn't been that consistent guy that we drafted him to be this year, much like a lot of the top end wide receivers, Diggs and Hopkins. These guys are all starting to slow down a little bit, and defenses are really keying in on them. And look, I know Travis Kelce was disappointing this past week, but against the Chargers, I do think that they're going to go back to him. You attack them over the middle of the field, and I do think that he's going to have a bounce back game here. So certainly not benching either of those two guys, but I don't think it's crazy depending on your other options to bench Mahomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's that crazy situation where it's like, I was talking about it with him, where from week 7 to now, I mean, you're looking at, he sprinkled in 3 weeks where he was top 3, top 5, and the rest of them, it's QB2 type numbers, and it's like, if you have that option of starting in a 1 quarterback league, say you have Rodgers, or a super flex league, you got someone else that's in that top 12 to 15 range, I have no problem with that. I feel like Tyreek Hill clearly is a must start. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is one that I'm getting a lot of questions on, because he's definitely splitting carries. He was definitely aided by the touchdowns this past week. How do you feel like he stacks up this week, and is he a must start? I feel like he falls into that RB2 category for me, which means, you get him in that RB2, maybe your flex situation. But talk to me a little bit about what you saw this past week from Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I mean, the Chargers are one of the bottom, 8 when it comes against the run.
Yeah, I mean, he's borderline top 12, top 10 running back for me this week. When you look at him early in the season, and even once he's come back from that injury, Edwards-Helaire has been their primary rusher. We know that it's frustrating when Darrell Williams vultures a touchdown here or there, but really when he's been healthy, Edwards-Helaire has been their primary guy. And as you said, it's much easier to attack this Chargers defense on the ground than it is through the air. The Chiefs defense is hot. This could be a far lower scoring game than many expect. And I do think that the Chiefs aren't afraid to just rely on Edwards-Helaire this week, as they should.
Yeah, and on the other side of the ball, I mean, the running back who, obviously a lot of us have been relying on, myself included, and Scott Fishbowl, Austin Eckler's banged up this week. He looked great down the stretch. But that ankle injury and several other things are starting to pile up. And we were wondering the whole time, is he able to shoulder the load? Is he going to be that guy? First time up against the Chiefs, over 20 fantasy points. I feel like he's a locked and loaded guy. You got to start him. But the injuries are starting to pile up there and becoming a little worrisome.
Well, I think it's a little worrisome if he even plays, right? I mean, one of my go-to resources for injury news is Pro Football Doc, Dr. David Chow on Twitter, and he's concerned about a potential higher ankle sprain that he suffered. This is a short week. They're playing on Thursday. If he's active, I can't imagine that there's many running backs you could bench Eckler for, but man, I think the floor is very low for him this week. Even if he plays, there's risk of aggravation or just inefficiency. And, I mean, all I'm saying is Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly should be rostered if you have Eckler on your dynasty team. If your trade window has not closed somehow, I would look to acquire them just in case.
Right on, when we were talking about that, not having trade deadlines, makes things a lot easier. Justin Jackson looked to be the guy a little bit more, but they split carries pretty evenly, but you have to feel like, Jackson has a little bit higher of that PPR ceiling and has a potential to, be a borderline RB2 in there, but I mean, fingers crossed that Eckler can come back there. Nice that, obviously we're going to get Keenan Allen. That's going to be a shot in the arm for our fantasy rosters. Who are some guys in this game that are flying a little bit under the radar? Jalen Guyton had a monster week here. Cook got in the end zone again. I feel like that's pretty much touchdown dependent. But is there anybody flying under the radar here that we should definitely be looking at?
I think if you're playing somebody outside of Williams and Keenan Allen, it might be Cook, just because the other news that I know we talk about fantasy relevant players for the most part, but lineman injuries are important. Rashawn Slater, their left tackle, is on the COVID list. So even if it is Jackson or Kelly starting, if Eckler's out, I'm not going to expect a whole lot out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, I don't think that we're going to see a long bomb to Jalen Guyton if they can't pass protect for Justin Herbert in this game. So I'm envisioning a lot of shorter stuff to Keenan Allen. I do think he's the most reliable option here. But if you're desperate, it's Cook for me over Guyton or Palmer.
Yeah, that's great stuff, and that's why I get super excited about those, and you break down all the, you bring me back in sometimes, like I see Chiefs Chargers, and I'm like, yeah, let's do this, this is going to be a great monster week to get that week started, and then it's like, yeah, but there's a lot of ups and downs there, and I feel like the nice part about having 2 games on Saturday and a game on Thursday this week is you have that idea of, we talked about ceiling plays. You're going to know pretty early, the chances are if you're going to have somebody on the Chiefs, Chargers, Raiders, Browns, Patriots, Colts, and have an idea of where you stand and what the rest of your moves should look like, if that's a type of situation. The other game on Saturday, we got Raiders going to Cleveland. The Browns, obviously Kareem Hunt, goes down this week. We've alluded a little bit. I think D'Ernest Johnson is a great guy where he's worthy of a pickup. I know he only had 5 touches this week, but we saw what he can do if Chubb were to go down, or if for whatever we're looking at fantasy purposes, if either of those guys would be out, he's put up 20 points every single time he's been on the field as a starter. And the Raiders, Hunter Renfrow, we talked about it. We were saying he's a top 12 option right now. Like, he really is when Darren Waller's not on the field. I mean, he is putting up excellent fantasy points. You got to set it and forget it when it comes to him.
Yeah, this game is so hard to project right now just because of all the COVID issues that the Browns have. And hopefully this is not something that foreshadows, something affecting all these other games in the coming weeks with COVID picking back up a little bit. Yeah, I mean,
look at Higbee this week. Like, that came out on Monday, and that was something where it's like, we talk about stockpiling running backs and stockpiling some of these things. You get to a situation where championship game, you're looking at a Monday night game, and now all of a sudden somebody gets COVID. It's like, whew, what are you going to do? And it almost makes you think a little bit, Mung, where it's like, if I have a safer option, on a Sunday night or Sunday during the day, I might start thinking that way a little bit, depending on where is that overthinking a little bit? I would just be crushed if we get to Monday night and you have no running backs or those kind of things.
Yeah, I'm not going to bench, a top 10 guy who's playing on Monday night for a lesser player on Sunday, just on the off chance that they test positive. But, I do think that, and I think we talked about this like a year ago during the height of COVID, when we were talking about the 2020 season, about how contrary to, popular belief, handcuffing might actually not be the way to go during these COVID seasons, because it could wipe out the entire running back room. Right. Look at the Dolphins situations.
Yeah. Malcolm Brown could be the starter this week, and he's been on IR. He's just bouncing back, and it's like, we have no idea. And whoever it is, that's a juicy situation against the Jets. Gaskin, last time they played them, had 26 fantasy points. So it's like, you're right. That wiped out the entire room, and it almost wiped out the entire Chargers wide receiver room. Those kind of things are just scary to me, and we're talked about it takes skill to get in, but that's some luck that you got to have your fingers crossed that those kind of things don't happen.
Yeah, but, let's get back to this matchup.
Sorry, I got on a tangent there. We haven't talked for a couple of weeks here. I wanted to kind of go back there. Let's talk Raiders-Browns.
Yeah, and real quick, it makes sense, right? Because this stuff is on all of our minds, both as fantasy players and just, people trying to live our lives with COVID going on. But really, it's out of our control, right? Mm-hmm. And we just shouldn't be focused too much on that. I know that's a risk, but again, I wouldn't be benching guys on the off chance that they test positive, in a later game. But really, I don't know. You trust Renfrow and Waller if he's back, and Jacobs, and that's really it on this Raiders offense. Because even with all the potential players out for Cleveland, none of them are really key defensive players. As long as Myles Garrett's on that field, it sounds like Greg Newsome could be back from the concussion. It's hard to trust any of Edwards or Zay Jones and Deshaun Jackson and hope for a long touchdown. I don't envision that happening. And on the Browns side, we'll really have to see if Landry's out. Obviously, Peoples-Jones gets a bump up, but we'll see about Austin Hooper as well. It sounds like Harrison Bryant could be back, but it depends on David Njoku if he's back from the COVID list. So it's hard to read into the Browns. Really, it's Chubb and Peoples-Jones if Landry are out.
Exactly. And I streamed Hooper this past week, but now he's on the COVID list. So it's like, there are definitely better options out there, and that's a game to try to avoid a little bit. The other one should be a great football game. We'll see how it goes for fantasy, but we had the Patriots traveling to the Colts, so let's talk a little bit about this game. Let's talk about Carson Wentz, Mac Jones. Are we comfortable starting them as QB2s here? I mean, obviously you're starting Jonathan Taylor. He's gotten you there, and that's been fantastic. The Colts, aside from that, there's been flashes here and there, but it's a difficult situation. There's not a lot of big fantasy relevant players in this game after you get to Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, I don't think comfortable is the right word for either of these quarterbacks, but at the same time, I don't think comfortable has been the right word for quarterbacks all year. We've seen ups and downs from even the elite names. Even when they are fully healthy, I'm not talking about injuries. Prescott struggled. Mahomes has struggled, and I think all of this is just more reason to stream in redraft formats and in dynasty formats, particularly one quarterback, to not pay up for some of these quarterbacks, because you can get Taysom Hill cheap.
Yes.
Tua was fairly cheap in dynasty prior to this year. Kirk Cousins is constantly underrated, but I digress. Going back to this matchup, you're not benching Jonathan Taylor. I mean, it doesn't matter what.
There's no option there.
Obviously, I don't think I need to say that, but just in case, I think Pittman's a flex play because Belichick does tend to try and take away, the opponent's strength. In which case, in this case, it's the run game. So even though they're good at stopping the pass, I do think they're going to play up a little bit more. I don't think you can trust anybody else on the Colts. I mean, this feels like a Zach Pascal game to me. But I would be very hard pressed to actually start him anywhere. The floor is so low for these pass catching options on the Colts. At the same time, on the other side, really, we'll see about Damian Harris. He's got that hamstring injury, but depending on who's healthy, you're starting the running backs here too, because this should be a pretty heavy ground and pound game on both sides.
Yeah, it's not. I feel like it'll be a fun football game, but it's not a lot of fantasy. And I mean, I'm glad you brought that up about the quarterbacks, because I was like, as soon as we get done with the regular season, I want to have a talk where we just sit this out and start talking about super flex strategy, because the quarterbacks have just let you down. There's a handful in there, and then it's like if you went and you planned and you took the guys that were in that 8 to 15 range, you're probably better off than really paying up for some of these options that you've had in the past. Moving on to Sunday, we got Tennessee at the Steelers. So I was talking today, and in Smash Accept Listener League 2, Dante Foreman went for a 2022 late third. That is the kind of move where it's like, he ended up putting up a nice little fantasy game. It is going to be very game script dependent when it comes to the Titans. It's going to be Hilliard or, why am I drawing a blank? It's going to be Hilliard when we're or in the kind of game script that we're looking that way. Looks like you just made a trade. Trade alert, man! I was just about to ask you, because he offered me Gibson and Sanders for Kamara, and then you go, you do it. It came through at 8:21, and I'm sitting here talking, and you accept the trade, man. All right.
Multitasking.
Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk. Well, I was about to ask you. It was like we were talking about this, and I saw it, and I'm like, oh, there it is. Okay. Well, I might not have accepted it, but I think you accepted Miles Sanders, Antonio Gibson, and Dallas Goedert for Saquon Barkley, essentially 3 for 1, and you threw in Devontae Booker. So I love that move for you. Especially just missing the playoffs. That gives you a couple nice pieces there to build around.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get back to the matchups, but just to touch on it, I just missed the fantasy playoffs in our Smash Accept Listener League, and I thought it was good value, right? Because I do still believe in Saquon Barkley as a top 5 elite dynasty running back. I think we've seen flashes as he started to get healthier of that prime Saquon, and he's still pretty young. But at the same time, this is a 14-team league, and really it's just hard to get bodies to fill some of these running back and flex spots, and it is points per carry. And, I believe in Antonio Gibson being, a top 12 running back if and when Washington can get this offense fixed. And, I needed Goddard. It's a tight end premium league. I've been running out Tyler Conklin because Johnny Smith has done absolutely nothing. And, Miles Sanders, who I think the talent is there if he ever gets out of this committee, but we'll see. I think it's a trade that made sense for both sides.
Yeah, no, and I was actually going to bring it up to you and likely accept it on my end because I am in a situation where like I need an extra starter here, so I might come knocking on your door here when we're
let's talk after the show.
Exactly. All right, that's awesome. So yeah, I was saying D'Onta Foreman I saw go for a 3rd round pick. I'm seeing when that game script goes a certain way, and it could in the Steelers game because we've seen the Steelers. We've seen them fall apart. We've seen it where it's a situation where it goes into the run game, and I feel like Foreman could be a guy who falls into that back-end RB2 type situation this particular week here.
Yeah, and I feel like people are still, remembering the steel curtain of the last few years where they've had a really good defense. The Steelers' defense is awful this year, just absolutely gutted. We saw Dalvin Cook gash them for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground this past week. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting that for any of the Titans running backs, but who's to say Foreman can't be a touchdown-dependent flex yet again this week? I do expect the Titans to win this game on the road. I took that pick, and really, I think this will be an interesting committee to watch down the stretch because I don't believe that Derrick Henry will be back in time for the fantasy championship week. I know some people are holding on to hope for that, but I would sell him if you're a contender and need the help. And really, it's Julio Jones and D'Onta Foreman. And if you're desperate, Ryan Tannehill does have some upside in this matchup.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. That Steelers defense, I mean, right now they are bottom 8 when it comes to, points against the fantasy running backs, and I feel like that's the situation they're going to be there. Najee doesn't have the easiest, schedule there. Tennessee's pretty good when it comes to stopping the run, but you got to roll him out there. I mean, Najee Harris has been a beast. Deontay Johnson has been fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about Chase Claypool because that's someone I'm a little worried starting in my fantasy playoffs. I have him on one of my teams. I mean, we all saw the debacle that happened last week, right? We saw where, he was benched for the ridiculous penalty he has. They get him out of the doghouse. He comes back in. He celebrates with like 35 seconds left, trying to win the game, and he's out there celebrating instead of giving the ball back, trying to get that quick spike the ball and stop it and keep things going. He's definitely in the doghouse. I mean, is that someone that we should be trusting? It's a difficult situation because you likely don't have too many options that are better than Chase Claypool, but it's definitely in the back of my mind.
Yeah, no, I absolutely not. I think he's a, boom or bust wide receiver 4 this week, and it's not even have to do anything with the off-field stuff. I just think that this is going to be a very different game script where the Steelers were down big going into halftime. I think they were even shut out at halftime, if I remember correctly. But it was a catch-up game script all the way through the second half. I think this is going to be a close, lower-scoring game than we saw last Thursday. I don't expect Ben to be just chucking it around like he was in the second half against Minnesota, who, by the way, is a defense that's very inconsistent, and they've had issues in the secondary, whereas Tennessee, for all their lack of big-name stars, their defense has played pretty well this year. And again, I think it's Deontay Johnson. As you said, Najee Harris, you're not benching him. And really, Freiermuth, and those are the 3 guys you want on the Steelers. And Claypool is, if you have to, start him, but I think you probably have better options.
Yeah, I mean, and Freiermuth, since the bye, is in a situation here where you look at his lowest fantasy output in standard scoring is 6 points, but you got weeks in there of 14, 21, 11, 14, 11. He's a must start at this point. Like Freiermuth is, if you got him in Dynasty, congratulations to you in your rookie draft in the second because he was a sleeper that fell in there to a lot of people. So that's definitely someone that you got to fire up here. Moving on to the Panthers-Bills We talked a little bit. Josh Allen is in a walking boot, but it sounds like probable. Emmanuel Sanders looks like he's trending towards being out with a knee injury. So Gabriel Davis and Cole Beasley definitely have some flex appeal this week. I think there's some guys that, if you're in a pinch, if you're missing a guy or you need that, upside guy. Gabriel Davis has had touchdowns in back-to-back weeks and is really starting to expand, just like we saw last year when he really got a chance to play.
Well, that depends, right? Is it Josh Allen or Mitch Trubisky?
If it's Mitch Trubisky, it's a different game, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's really going to be a 50-50 call, right? Because the Bills are looking forward to the playoffs. They don't want to rush Allen back. This is a game that they can win with Trubisky, right? So obviously those guys' floors are all lower if it's Trubisky. But yeah, we know who you're starting and who you're not on Buffalo, right? I don't know that we have to talk about that too much. You're not starting any of the running backs, hopefully.
Never.
If it is, it's probably Breda. It sounds like he just has the most burst as a playmaker right now, given what we've seen.
Yeah, and on the Panthers side, I mean, it's been tricky, right? I mean, there's not too much aside from DJ Moore that I'm comfortable starting with at this point. It's just been a lot of up and down on that offense.
Yeah, it's sneaky PPR start maybe in deeper leagues. Potentially Amir Abdullah. He's taken over the receiving role with McCaffrey out. And this is a game where I could see Carolina trailing in the second half. And whether it's Walker or Newton under center at that point, I do think that Abdullah is going to get quite a few checkdowns.
Yeah, no, I like that as well. Washington travels to Philly. This is one where, we were talking about Logan Thomas having those opportunities. Ricky Seals-Jones was someone who, played really well when Logan Thomas was out, but this week looked a little bit sluggish, moving around and things. And now we get Gibson, who plays that Eagles defense, where he's done very well against them in the past. The Eagles' run defense has been good, but Antonio Gibson has become a lot more game script dependent, right? I mean, we've seen him have some great performances where he's getting 20-plus touches. Then we have one like this week where, they fell behind even with McKissick out, and he only, amassed 10 touches.
Yeah, it's tough. This Washington offense just doesn't look great so far. The good thing is they are top 10 in run rate. Since they came out of the bye, they've really tried to establish that run. Again, a lot of uncertainty here on this side, right? Because it sounds like Taylor Heineke is going to be healthy enough to start. We don't know about Terry McLaurin with the concussion, but I was talking to our friend of the show, Dave Kluge, earlier today on Twitter, and quite frankly, I'd be pretty nervous playing Terry McLaurin, even if he is cleared from concussion protocol, right? Yeah. He just hasn't seen a ton of targets, hasn't been producing in this Washington offense that's struggling. And on top of that, he'd likely see a lot of Darius Slay, even if he's active. I talked about this yesterday, too. I think he's a back-end flex, maybe. He's a real risky start, and I'd be starting guys like Russell Gage over Terry McLaurin this week.
I'm glad you said that because here's the situation. What I've been doing is on my leagues, we talked about holding your first this year, using it as firepower, right? So my leagues where I have Terry McLaurin, it's only one actually. I took Terry McLaurin and my late first, and I traded it for Kittle in tight end premium because there's a lot of Terry McLaurin fans out there, but I'm not comfortable starting Terry McLaurin. You're right. I mean, he feels like a back end flex, but obviously Kittle is the guy that's going to go out there and potentially win you some weeks. And there's some situations here where you can get those situations where it's like, I'm not comfortable starting this guy, but it's like I don't have too much on my bench that I'm also comfortable in. So maybe I package that with somebody here in the trade deadline. I did that also with Hawkinson. I gave up Hawkinson in a first for Kittle. And I feel like there's some moves you can make if you don't have a trade deadline where you're giving up some draft capital, but you're putting yourself in a position where you feel a lot more comfortable going into the fantasy playoffs.
Well, I mean, my feelings on Kittle, so we don't have
to. Dude, you nailed it, man. You nailed it. And it's like Kittle and Andrews are beasts in an absolute. I mean, they are winning you leagues right now. Kittle he's playing on another level right now. He's playing out of his mind. I mean, 47 fantasy points in our Smash League this week. That's insane. That's like starting 4 tight ends. And when I roll out Evan Ingram, that's like starting 12 tight ends. Moving on.
quite frankly, I think McLaurin and a first for Kittle is stealing in tight
Yeah.
end.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are really big still on Terry McLaurin, and I had a guy message me today about this, and he said, I have Jamar Chase and T Higgins. Would you trade T Higgins for Terry McLaurin? I said, not right now. Like if you want to explore it in the offseason, but give me. The Bengals have some juicy matchups. I mean, yeah, they play the Broncos this week, but they get KC and they got some nice matchups down the stretch where it's like I would rather have the touchdown upside of T Higgins in an offense that's clicking with a quarterback that's elite as opposed to what's going on in Washington right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Texans Jaguars, right? We all predicted Davis Mills was going to be the top passer for this past week, right? We all knew he was going to have the most passing yards. But this game, I think the biggest question, is James Robinson. What are we doing here? Is he startable at all? I mean, John and I went back and forth on this where it's like there's been certain parts of the season, Mung, where we were like, James Robinson's really ascending and they're starting to put things together. Now it's like, ooh, he put up less than 1 fantasy point this week.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we talked about dating back to last offseason, right? I was an advocate for selling Robinson for a second. I know people wanted a first because, again, it boils down to the fact that it doesn't really matter how good he is or how good you and I think he is. It matters what the Jaguar staff thinks, and they spent a first-round pick on Travis Etienne. And when Etienne was healthy, I fully expected him to get that lead role or at least the 1A. And even now, with him gone, we're seeing that they're not committed to Robinson. And quite frankly, it's a little baffling because he's clearly miles ahead of Carlos Hyde, given Hyde's age. I do think Hyde was an underrated player in his prime, and we saw him have some nice seasons in San Francisco. But yeah, I mean, Robinson's a flex, I guess.
Is there? Brandon Cooks is the only guy I feel comfortable starting in this entire game. I mean, Laquan Treadwell has had a nice little resurgence here for his Devontae Parker bit for 5th-year breakout. And it's like, but there isn't a lot going on. Marvin Jones has been, big time disappointment. We thought some things might happen there. There's just not a lot to trust in this game other than Brandon Cooks as a flex and maybe James Robinson this is just a game to avoid. Period.
Yeah, this is one of those ugly games where it comes down to, it really comes down to balls or ovaries, whatever you want to call them, and how big they are. Because
I liked how that was very PC. I like that.
Thank you. Because it sounds like Rex Burkhead could miss this game.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, Brevin Jordan has been getting a lot of targets from Davis, especially in the red zone. So look, David Johnson, Royce Freeman, and Brevin Jordan are all viable candidates. But it depends on your other options, right?
Yeah.
And it's simply impossible to get through all the sit-start conversations in one show. So this is why we ask you guys to, reach out to us on Twitter, right? Because are you starting David Johnson? I hope not, but it depends on your other options, right? It depends on your other running back options, your other flex options, and really, it's hard to go through all these thousands of scenarios where you have other players. But, I mean, they're viable. On the other side, James Robinson is viable. If you're desperate, maybe Carlos Hyde punches in a touchdown, but I certainly wouldn't bet on it.
You're probably not in the playoffs if you're that desperate.
People are in some deep 14, 16-team leagues, right?
I know it's tough. It is tough.
And but yeah, I mean, really, it's Robinson and Cooks and maybe the other guys that we just talked about.
Yeah, is this the week where the Cowboys' offense really clicks and takes it to the Giants? We've wanted to see it. Dak's had some flashes here and there, and I feel like all 3 wide receivers are equally involved right now. Amari seems like they're all falling in that same category where they're guys you start, but it's like, are we finally going to see what we've been wanting to see from Dak against this Giants team? Is he going to put us into a situation where all 3 wide receivers and Dalton Schultz are all viable this week?
Well, the short answer is no. The longer answer is a little bit more complicated where I'm not sure exactly why, but people have this idea in their head that the Giants' defense is bad. And that's simply not true. They're top 10 in DVOA against the pass. They've got some nice pieces in the secondary. It's really just because this Giants team has been awful overall that I think people have this idea, but they've played teams tough. You're not benching Dak. I can't imagine you have better options in Superflex, but in one quarterback, I think he's a fringe back-end QB1. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're starting Lamb and Cooper, but it's hard to rely on these guys because another issue is Prescott just hasn't looked, consistent coming back from that calf injury. I don't know if that's still affecting him or if it was just the missed reps, but this Dallas offense is not what we saw coming out the gate in week 1 against Tampa Bay in that shootout.
Yeah, I mean, aside from if you're looking from week 11 down, and aside from week 12 against the Raiders, I mean, you're looking at less than 5 fantasy points against KC and less than 15 against New Orleans and Washington. I was bringing that up because, the Giants defense, I didn't want to trash on them, but they are, they're 12th friendliest when it comes to the quarterback. So, I mean, it's kind of in line with where you're saying. It's not like a big juicy matchup where it's like all in, but this is like where you want them to show up. This is where it's like, I need my Cowboys to show up and I need Zeke to show up and I need, between Zeke and Saquon, I made some moves to pick up Saquon this week because I feel like Saquon is starting to, he's not quite passing the eye test, but he's getting the volume. He's getting much more involved. And I would love to see, a Saquon reemergence here over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and look, I like Barkley, but it's still a committee for the Giants right now. They haven't, I don't think they want to fully expend his services in this lost season. And at the same time, he is still coming back off of the multiple injuries. But yeah, I mean, it's tough because going back to Dallas real quick, it's like what we've seen from Kansas City, right? Surprisingly, these are two teams where their defense is getting them the wins right now, not offenses that we thought were going to be explosive in the preseason. But yeah, and with Mike Glenn under center, I don't trust anybody on the Giants outside of Barkley.
The giraffe himself. Cardinals, Lions, this is a matter of what running back's going to be healthy, right? James Conner had a little bit of ankle injury in there. I know you're a lot more in tune with injuries. They were talking about DeAndre Swift potentially going to IR. Now you see, Dan Campbell coming out saying he's very hopeful they play. I know hopeful's, just kind of one of those words. But what's the early word on both of these guys? I mean, you have to want if Edmonds, which they say Edmonds is coming back this week, if James Conner doesn't play, Edmonds stock way up in this game because you have to feel like the Cardinals are going to go up and they're going to run the ball against the Lions. James Conner has proven over this last 8-10 weeks he is a dominant RB1 in this offense, and if he's healthy, you got to roll him out.
Yeah, the early word is that they're not too concerned with Conner. They said he was walking without a limp after the game. He just got up kind of slow, so I think more hurt than injured. So certainly you're starting him as long as he's active. I mean, it's tough because another guy, we talked about Julio Jones's decline a lot this year, but DeAndre Hopkins doesn't quite look the same. And I understand he's coming back from the hamstring injury, but even when he was healthy early in the season, they really went away from him being a target hog. They've spread this offense a lot more. They've spread the targets around, and it's good for the Cardinals, but it's bad for Hopkins as a fantasy wide receiver. You're still starting him, especially against Detroit.
You have to, but he feels more like I feel comfortable saying he's a wide receiver too than trying to each week. I'm not even thinking mentally looking for wide receiver 1 numbers because he hasn't been putting them up. He's still somebody you start it week in and week out. But you're right. I mean, I think some of it's the maturation of Kyler Murray, not just locking on to one guy, but finding the open player, and it's also a matter of, we're getting up there at that age line. So it's like, if you are, and this is one that I've talked about in the past, if you're in the playoffs and you're not totally wild on the flip side about what's going on with DeAndre Hopkins, you can sell him for Hunter Renfrow plus. You can sell him for a guy that you're very comfortable with and get some picks and get some insulation there on guys that are putting up numbers, and because we all know as soon as the offseason rolls around with DeAndre Hopkins this year, the value is going to drop, because he's going to be at that age cliff where it's going to be a tough sell.
Yeah, and on the other side here with the Lions, if you told me you're starting Amon-Ra St. Brown over Terry McLaurin this week,
I'm okay with that.
Crazy.
Yeah.
12 targets in each of the last 2 games. Jared Goff doesn't have his blanket DeAndre Swift to check down to right now, so he's checking down to his wide receivers left and right. Reynolds has some upside, although I think he's a little bit shakier. Amon-Ra St. Brown seems to be the preferred guy. And yeah, both are viable in PPR in what, the Cardinals are favored by 14 points, right? So there should be a lot of garbage time potential. You're nervous anytime you're tying your fantasy playoff hopes to Jared Goff, but volume is volume.
Yeah, and I think Jamal Williams is a low-key play here. Hopefully he gets a lot more involved, in the passing game, because we have a lot. The Lions situation at the running back position this past week, we all thought we knew what we were going to happen, right? I mean, everybody was playing certain ways, and then all of a sudden, nope, it's not any of that. They just roll out who they want. So, I mean, it's a tricky situation. We hope that Swift is back. I kind of feel like they pull a similar type situation that the Jets did and put Elijah Moore on IR just to be on the healthy side. Moving over to that Jets-Dolphins game, this is the one where I was like, if Myles Gaskin is cleared from COVID, he is somebody that I want to go out there and buy, because this Jets defense is porous against the run. It's a situation where it's definitely set up for some positive game script for them to run the ball. And also, in Smash, except there was a move to get Tua, and I think Tua could be a nice, high-end QB2 this week against that Jets defense.
Yeah, I love Tua. I do a weekly article on quarterback streamers for Fantrax, and Tua's at the top of that list this week. I think he's got a high floor and a decent ceiling as well against the Jets. I mean, we saw what he did against them a few weeks ago, and that was in New York, and they're at home in Miami. Mm-hmm. On the other side here, talk about unsexy names that you might rely on in the fantasy playoffs, but Braxton Berrios with Jamison Crowder and him as the only healthy options left, with Moore and Davis gone. I mean, he's probably going to see quite a few targets. We know Miami likes to blitz. Wilson's going to need to dump it off pretty quickly, and Berrios seems to be that guy based off of a very small sample size so far.
Yeah, and depending what we see, I mean, if you're in a deep situation, Ty Johnson is bound to catch several passes in this game, in negative game script, trying to catch up. If Tevin Coleman bounces back this week, I mean, there's rumor that Michael Carter, whoever that running back is, he's going to get some dumping. They're going to get some, I feel like that's a safe bet for one of those guys to be in that 10 to 12 range. So, again, not a sexy game, but you can definitely pull some things in there. Mike Gesicki's a start, Devontae Parker, Jalen Waddle. Obviously, you're starting Waddle. Waddle's like, you've missed the boat if you haven't picked up on him. But Devontae Parker, when he's out there on the field, is always worth a stream. It's not the exciting name that you brag about, but he actually can go out there and do it.
Parker or McLaurin in PPR.
Man, that I would debate it, but I think I'd still roll McLaurin out there.
I think it's Parker for me.
Man, that's tight. Hey, moving on to Bengals Broncos here. Both running backs have proved, in that Denver system to be, we all want Javonte Williams to be the guy. He will be the guy at some point. But Melvin Gordon isn't going away. Melvin Gordon is definitely, you and I talked about that on the Buy Low show as well, is like, if you bought him for a second, he goes out there. I mean, this past week he had 2 touchdowns again, put up over 20 fantasy points. He's somebody that you plug and play as a flex, no problem at all. Jerry Jeudy, and some of the other pieces. I mean, I think you're starting Noah Fant, but Jeudy seems to be up and down. Teddy Bridgewater, hopefully you have a better QB2 option, in that Broncos offense. And the Bengals, I know it's a tough game for them, but I feel like you're firing up everybody.
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is another one where it's tough, right? I don't think you can trust any of the Broncos pass catchers.
No.
This is...
No, and Fant, I wouldn't trust Fant if it wasn't in a tight position, like tight end, but it's like I would trust him to go out there, but I feel like he's probably back end tight end 1 type numbers.
I mean, tight end it's a mess, right? It's just there's no good answer unless you have one of the top guys. I mean, I guess he's a back end tight end 1, but I'd be starting guys like Knox over him.
Yeah. I love Knox. He's really been coming on.
Even Goddard. I wish Minshew were still there for the sake of Goddard, but even with Hurts, I'd start Goddard over Fant. I mean, Teddy's just not throwing a ton, and when he is, he continues to spread it around.
Yeah.
I doubt he sees more than 4 or 5 targets, unless this becomes a shootout. But
Yahoo has Fant as the tight end 15 this week. Behind Knox, behind Goddard, behind Schultz, behind Higbee. It's like it's a tough situation for him.
Yeah, we'll see.
Not much you can do there.
On the other side, real quick, look, if you're desperate in deeper leagues, Samaje Perine is getting some receptions, kind of like that Ty Johnson type role. Again, hopefully you've made it here and have better running back options if you're in the fantasy playoffs. But hey, sometimes you scrape by, and sometimes that 4, 5, 6 points is what makes the difference between a win and a loss in PPR formats.
Yep. Moving on to 49ers, Falcons. This is when obviously you're starting Debo. Ayuk has been balling out. Kittle's been fantastic. And I'm not quite sure where we're at with Elijah Mitchell, but Jimmy Garoppolo is one of those guys where, we were saying Tua's streamable. Jimmy Garoppolo in this type of situation against the Falcons, stringing together a couple decent games here, is someone that I'm not completely out on starting this week either. Obviously in a super flex on one quarterback league, you're not messing around at all.
I'm not completely out on him, but I also he's not in the top 15 or 18 quarterbacks for me. Credit where it's due, right? Garoppolo's been playing better as of late in recent weeks. He's made some great throws under pressure against the Bengals. But at the same time, I expect this to be a very different game script. I think that San Francisco's defense is good enough where they'll be nursing a fairly healthy lead in the second half. I don't expect nearly as many pass attempts. And at the same time, while we know that the Falcons secondary is pretty awful, their defense overall isn't great. So I do think that the run can get exploited as well. So I still expect a lot of Mitchell and Samuel on the ground vulturing those touchdowns. So I just don't see a high ceiling for him. If you need that QB2, I think the matchup's fine. Yeah. But, I mean, we know this is one of the more clear-cut games this week, right? We know that you're starting Patterson and Gage, and we know you're starting Debo, Kittle, and maybe Ayuk. Yeah. And obviously Mitchell if he's healthy.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Davis has put up back-to-back weeks in double digits, which is surprising. But the way Cordarrelle Patterson has played, I can't see wanting to start that way. We got 4 more matchups here, and I definitely want to keep the time going. The one I want to talk about, I want to talk about the Ravens. How are you treating the Lamar Jackson injury right now? Because I have teams with Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen. How are we treating this situation? Is Huntley viable? What are you seeing? And the Packers defense is not one to joke about. I mean, that is a solid defense when it comes to, they're giving up 13th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback right now.
Yeah, this is a game where I'm very surprised at the initial Vegas line because let me pull it up real quick. But the last time I looked at it, I believe the over-under was set at 43.5 points. And to me, this feels like an absolute shootout of a game. I don't know if it's concerns about Rodgers' toe or what it is because the Packers defense has been good this year, but at the same time, we just saw on Sunday night that they have trouble with the mobile quarterback. So whether it's Jackson or Huntley under center, I think you're starting them. On the other side, the Ravens have just so many injuries on defense. You're starting Rodgers, you're starting Adams. Allen Lazard is a boomer bust wide receiver 4 who's in play. We'll see if Equanimeous St. Brown can pass concussion protocol, but with Cobb already out, that condenses the target share a little bit. Obviously, Andrews, flex Marquise Brown and Rashad Bateman. Those guys are a little bit more boomer bust too. But I want to talk about the Packers running backs because I don't trust Aaron Jones this week. He's maybe a back end RB2.
It's tough because I feel like you have to start him. I mean, this week, if you look at his numbers, they weren't that flashy. Multiple touchdowns, but he was definitely, they were splitting the load, and I feel like it's going to be whoever's scoring the touchdowns, and I think Aaron Jones right now, I mean, Yahoo has him as the RB8 this week, which definitely feels on the high end. I feel like I have him as a back end RB1 because, this past week he put up 21.5, but he only had 5 carries.
That RB8, that's crazy to me. And that's insane. I mean, when you look at it, AJ Dillon just touched the ball a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Jones has that chemistry with Rodgers, right? And he's a very good player. Don't get me wrong, but the volume's not there. He's a touchdown dependent RB2, and the Ravens are good at stopping the run.
I mean, they have him projected over Saquon, Chubb, Gibson, Connor, Patterson, Zeke, Mitchell. I mean, they have him up there, man. He is up there, and they have him projected at 17 points in full PPR, which feels like that's definitely generous. But he has that ceiling. You can't bench him. Like I would not feel comfortable unless you are completely deep. I'm rolling out Aaron Jones because I feel like he gets into the end zone for sure.
Yeah, and when we're talking about these matchups, right? Obviously, the list of healthy running backs right now with secure workloads is small, right? I'm not saying you're benching Aaron Jones, but it depends on your other options, right? Because maybe you are.
You know who I want to start this game is Devonta Freeman. He is like right now. Devonta Freeman is one of the most underrated running backs for this fantasy season because he has gone out there week in and week out over the last couple of weeks, and he's been very, very consistent. I mean, if you look at from week 6 on, he's had 2 games at 8 and 7, but the rest of them are between 12 and 20 points, and he just feels like you could still buy him for a pair of 3rd-round picks in your fantasy league. Like I feel like you could get a dynasty buy here on a guy like this that could be a serviceable RB2 flex for you down the stretch.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe you'll disagree, but I think if you have Freeman and Aaron Jones, it's clearly Freeman for me this week.
Ooh, see, now I would still start if I had to pick one of them. Yes, I'd probably pick Jones because I feel like we talked about that. Maybe he's the ceiling play and Freeman's the the floor play. But yeah, that's tough. That's tough.
I think
I definitely don't have them. I mean, Yahoo has Devonta Freeman as the RB24 right above AJ Dillon, and they have Aaron Jones all the way up at it's actually RB7.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that they both have high ceilings, but Freeman has the higher floor at this point.
Yeah, no, and this past week it wasn't for a lot of yards, but he caught 5 passes. I mean, he is getting all the work, and that's something very, very good to see, from his end. I got to ask you, Mung, it's like if you were a Lamar Jackson owner, and we talked about this before, there are not too many guys that like I'm trying to trade Lamar Jackson for, right? Like I don't want to give up on Lamar Jackson. But if you had to, I'm trying to go out there and I'm trying to buy Tua, I'm trying to buy Cousins. Who would you start if you had to choose, given the situation, between Tua and Lamar this week? Is that a smash for you?
Sorry, say that question again.
Tua Tagovailoa or Lamar Jackson, given the ankle injury?
Just this week?
Just this week.
Oh, man. I think it depends on who your opponent is and how many points you're favored or, are trying to make up here. Because I think the floor is Tua. And the ceiling is still Jackson because, like I said, I expect this to be well over the 43.5 points.
Yeah, it's like because I'm getting a lot of questions. People are asking what they should do with Lamar Jackson and what they should do in these situations. And I said, well, you can trade. You can move back and try to accumulate some value. Try to get a Joe Burrow, a Matthew Stafford, an Aaron Rodgers, something like that. But for the most part here, I'm suggesting you go out there and you buy Taysom Hill, you buy Tua, you buy Cousins. Even there's a lot of situations even where you can buy like Garoppolo on the cheap. You got to know who you're playing against here if you're not comfortable, depending on where Lamar Jackson is and depending if you have Tyson Huntley.
Well, yeah, I was going to say the easy solution is to bite the bullet and pay a second for Huntley, right?
Yeah.
I think you don't have to sell Jackson per se. And for what it's worth, it does sound like he'll play. But, if you don't want that risk, then Huntley is the cheapest to acquire, I would think.
Mung, I got to tell you, I'm glad I have 12 buys out of my 14 playoff teams because that's a tough call. It's like if you're in that situation, you're like, hey, I can sit with Lamar. And maybe the thing to do is if you're on a buy, make an offer to the guy that has Lamar. Just be like, hey, you want to move back here a little bit and see what you can do. Seahawks, Rams, can you start DK Metcalf? he has been the wide receiver 56 over the last 5 weeks. And I have a trade in my inbox right now, DK Metcalf and Damian Harris for Cooper Kupp. So both of these guys are in this game. I feel like I got to give that. I mean, before the season started, would you ever consider that? No. But at this point, Cooper Kupp is the real deal.
Yeah, I mean, if you're contending, that's a smash, except to me. Look, winning titles is more important than winning trades, right? It doesn't matter the age gap right now for these next 3 weeks. It just doesn't. Nope. Because you're taking on that risk, and you want. Look, there's a 7-year age gap, something like that between them. But if you win a title, that pays for your next 7 years of dues for the most part, right?
I love that. People don't think that way. It's like my one league, I mean, I've won back-to-back years, but I made some trades this past, mid-season where I gave up some really young players for some older veterans, and they're like, oh, think about how that's gonna affect. And I'm like, that league pays out 10-1, because almost all the money goes to the winner. I'm like, this is paid for. Like, if I win this, it pays $550 buy-in. I mean, that is like paid for. You're set for 10 years on that. You can reset the clock very easy if you go buy Cooper Kupp. And guess what? You can trade him again in the offseason if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, and look, I just responded to a question about DK Metcalf on Twitter before we recorded, maybe like an hour or two. And again, I don't think that you have to bench him. It depends on your other options, right? Because we've seen that he's had a touchdown taken away by penalty. He's been open in the end zone. So the opportunities have been there, but it's not. And look, we don't even know if Jalen Ramsey's playing, and even if he hasn't shadowed much this year. So it's not the matchup that concerns me. It's the fact that, one, Russell Wilson hasn't looked great coming back from the finger surgery, and two, DK Metcalf's been limited in practice for a few weeks here and there with a foot issue. I don't know how much, if at all, that's been affecting him. But this is just a disjointed Seattle offense. And I think he's boomer bust wide receiver 3 flex option. I mean, he's not a top 4 or no. Excuse me, top 24 wide receiver.
I was going to say he's barely a top 30. He's in that over the last 5 weeks. It's been wide receiver 56, and Tyler Lockett is the guy that's getting the deep balls. And Tyler Lockett has been putting up fantasy viable options. And it's like Metcalf, I am not starting him as even a wide receiver 3. And I know that sounds crazy, but if you have the options, and we keep talking about this, and this is a matter of like, send this into us because we're just trying to give you guys a little insight, but I am not comfortable starting DK Metcalf.
Well, that's the problem, right? Because there aren't many reliable options in general, even at wide receiver. So let's go through just a couple names. I know we're short on time, but Michael Pittman or DK Metcalf this week?
Pittman, but it's close. What about Russell? What about Russell Gage?
Oh, it's Gage for me.
See, that sounds crazy. And that's what we talked about in the beginning is like, it doesn't mean you have to start your studs. You can go out there and, I mean, there's like, would you consider KJ Osborne? Like, he's been putting up points. There's some interesting type players where it's like, what do you do? Would you go with that guy because he's had a couple solid weeks in a row?
I mean, let's go back to Devontae Parker.
Ooh, I love Devontae Parker. He's tugging on my heartstrings. That's a very even one, and that sounds crazy, right? It sounds crazy to even think that would be even. I would slightly, because of the, I would go DK there. Yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like it's just the fact that we're thinking about it is why we love fantasy football so much.
If you're an underdog, Allen Lazard is in play with a higher ceiling, I think, if that game shoots out versus this one. But
I would definitely not start any Saints wide receivers, though.
Well, I don't think we need to go into that territory.
And that's the only game we really didn't cover. You're starting your Bucks. I had some people ask me, like, I think I'm starting too many Bucks when I start Gronk, Evans, and Godwin. And I said, no, you're not. You just start them all. Like,
I think it's worth talking about Mike Evans.
Okay.
Because he has struggled against Marshawn Lattimore, right? Mm-hmm. He salvaged his day the last time they played the Saints earlier this year with a touchdown. And we know that Evans is always a threat to score, right? We know he's one of Brady's favorite red zone targets. But without that, you're looking at 2 catches for 48 yards last time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not great. I mean, he's a high.
You're just bashing all my guys in Smash, except Evans and Aaron Jones. Man, I was feeling good about my playoff shot this week, but no, I'm just kidding.
I mean, look, there's the chance that Evans scores 3 touchdowns, right? That's why you're not necessarily benching him just because of the tough matchup. But again, it depends on your other options, and if you're favored by quite a few points, maybe you want the floor of a Russell Gage type.
Speaking, this has been fun, and I really want to say to you guys as the listeners, just send us. We're here this week. I'm off on Sunday. Send us DMs. Send us some messages. See what we can do to try to help you guys out with the start sits, because we want you guys to win those playoff spots. And we will have a spot open. We reference the Smash Accept Listener Leagues. We're debating starting another one, but we definitely have a spot open in Smash Accept Listener League 1. So if you want a chance to play with Mung and I, hit either of us up in our DMs. And it's a pretty, it's a team that just missed the playoffs. They were the 7 seed, so it's a decent squad. If you guys want a shot. Andrew, yeah. Okay. But just a lot of things in life going on. But that's a great opportunity if you guys want to get in there. Our group chat is amazing. There's dudes in there talking nonstop. And we try to get in there as well. So, Mung, why don't you tell everybody what you have going on, and we will close it up.
Well, we didn't talk about the Vikings and Bears yet, right?
I was skipping Monday night. I was gonna let's do it.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot to talk about. You know who you're starting on these teams, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where we're at with time. I mean, you're starting Dalvin, you're starting Cousins, you're definitely starting Mooney. Justin Fields is the interesting question. I have to start 2 out of the 3. You ready? Taysom Hill, Derek Carr, and Justin Fields in the FFPC playoffs, where I feel like I'm an underdog.
I don't know the FFPC scoring, but it's not Carr for me. It's the 2 running guys.
It's 4-point passing and 6-point rushing when you do the touchdowns. So I'm like, it feels like Fields and it's definitely Taysom Hill. It ain't gonna be pretty with Taysom Hill, but it's gonna happen.
I'll say too that I think Taysom Hill is riskier than people think he is this week. He's a high ceiling option, but I think the low floor is there. We're not quite as enamored with him, if not for that 40-yard touchdown to close out the game against the Jets last week. Without that, he doesn't feel quite as sexy here. And even though we saw Josh Allen just gash the Bucs on the ground, let's not forget he also had 300 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. So it wasn't all on the ground.
Yeah, for sure.
But all right, I know we're low on time, so like I said, so much to talk about this week. You guys can find us on Twitter. I'm at FFA_Mung. That's MENG.
Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and enjoy the process.